All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for another conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about documentation requirements is something we're going to talk about today. But as everybody is giving people some time to come in, Harriet, how was the family? How was the weekend?
The weekend is good. The family was well. I took a page out of your book on Sunday. I did nothing but church, and then I got a 3 hour nap. I ignored phone calls. I did not respond to texts. I took one business phone call yesterday, and I didn't even do that work until today. And so I'm going to start resting on Sundays because this morning I woke up before my alarm. I was refreshed. The thoughts were flowing. Everything that I could not figure out how to resolve, I had it done by the time I had gotten out the shower and gotten in the car. So
That's
rest
amazing.
makes your brain clear. And like I solved
That's
a week worth of stuff in a 2 hour time span this morning. So yeah, I'm gonna be resting on Sundays. I'm gonna find me a church that don't last longer than 90 minutes. I'm gonna give God his time and I'm gonna take the rest of the day. That's it. You have made me a believer. That's it.
you
It
know
felt good.
it's amazing how much of a difference that consistently resting does,
Hmm.
because I mean it just seems so counterintuitive, because you think about like, hey, there's all this stuff I need to get done. I need every second that I possibly have to do this work. And then once I started, like, you know what, on at least one day a week, I'm not looking at a screen,
Nope.
I'm not looking at work. Like, even like yesterday, Lola and I, we hung out, talked, listened to some sermons, and went out and got something to eat, came back and was just doing a movie marathon. And I'm like, it's so stress relieving when you're like, you know what, I don't have anything else on my agenda today. Like,
It's unbelievable. And so
mm.
yeah, I don't know why I've been depriving myself the last several years. I'm going to rest one day a week. The business will be there. If not, the Lord will send more. That's what I meant. That's it. I am
No,
not a doctor. I cannot be on call 24/7.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think just with the ideas of being able to have, give yourself time to consume and get those fresh ideas. Now, one thing I will say, that this is a next level of resting that I don't know if I'm there yet. And a friend that brought it up to me was like, hey, like, one of the things that they do when they're resting is they try to avoid social media at all costs. I was like, I'm not there yet.
No, I can't do it. First of all, I watch church online. Okay, let's start there. All right, right now in this season, I need it. Right there. But I can see how unplugging for social media would really free your mind. Cause you look at other people's stuff and your mind start going and you start wondering. So I can see, but yeah, I'm not there yet.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not there quite yet, but good. Well, I'm glad that your weekend was great. And then I think also, what one of the things that I find to be helpful is that taking time to catch my breath over the weekends, and taking that Saturday, it does give me some time to think about some good topics. I'll even kind of read through some of the comments that people have left, and one of the things that has come up was, this topic about documentation, and like, what do I need to keep, or how do I get this non-for-profit started? Because Saturday I taught a class on, like, picking your business structure and basics of taxation for businesses. And one of the people in the organization, I mean, or in the class, was asking about a not-for-profit and stuff, and like, hey, what's needed and stuff. And I was like, you know what, this documentation section is an important one, and it's part of what we talked about with the board of directors, how having, the board of directors, part of their role is maintaining that supporting documentation for different things. So I felt like this one was definitely a topic for us to dive a little bit more into.
Hmm.
So when you're looking at a church, how often do you find that, when you go in to audit them, that they have the right documentation in place?
Um, Again, the question has a broad answer for me. It depends on the church. My answers always fall along the lines of denomination versus non-denomination. Because if you're in a denomination, there y'all been doing this for hundreds of years. There's a discipline, a group of rules that to follow. You have semi-annual conferences and meetings and all these things, and it's there. With the non-denominational ministries, where we're starting from scratch, that's kind of where I can kind of sometimes see the issues, right? Did you set it up properly? So to start a nonprofit, which most churches you filing for that 501c3 tax exempt status, you have to have bylaws. They look for conflict of interest policies. They look for these rules, regulations, and procedures. And so the other problem with that is you have a lot of things out here, a lot of programs that you can jump online. They got the cookie cutter documents that, hey, this is everything you need to start your nonprofit. $500, I give you all the forms. Well, that's cool if your church ran the way the cookie cutter church ran. And there's nothing wrong with that to get started. But those are the documents you need. You need your bylaws, your conflict of interest policies. And I go deeper than that. I go ahead and do a handbook and all that good stuff. And so what do I see? Some people have it, some people don't. Everybody usually needs something to get the 501c3. There's usually the cookie cutter stuff that doesn't really apply to what y'all doing, but it'll get you past the IRS to get going. But it might hurt you if you come in later and they audit you and you're not following the rules that are in place that you have there, or you doing your own thing. So that's what I see.
Gotcha. No, I mean, and, you brought up a really good point, because several people asked me that question. Like, even when I was doing the class this past weekend on business structures, and people asked, well, is working with a professional, same thing as just going to like LegalZoom or something and getting it online? I mean, from your perspective as a lawyer, when you hear someone say that, how do you usually answer that question?
Don't compare your Google search with my $100,000 law degree. I'm me now, Terrell. Right? Google's free. I gave Carolina Law $100,000, $142,000 to be exact, because I was out of state, to learn to do what I'm doing. And so I'm not saying that the Google searches can't help you. Okay, they can give you background and an overview, but no two churches are exactly alike. Some things are nuanced, and so when you're dealing with a professional, you expect to get a heightened level of skill, right? That may be more suited for the facts and the scenarios that you're dealing with. So, and I'm not telling churches don't use Google. Do it. It's cool, but if you need something to hang your hat on, or if what you're getting there is not enough, then you might need a professional. There's value in both. It depends on what you need. I'll say that. But you asked me how I answered the question. I'm sarcastic. Forgive me, Jesus.
But no, I think there is so much truth to that. I mean, because one of the things I think that we're living through, and like where you hear it talked about the most, is when it comes down to things involving politics, where people talk about, misinformation, and you see all of these different fact checks that come out. Is one of the things that I think people miss a lot when it comes down to legal and financial advice, is what the person is saying or what you're reading may not necessarily be false in all circumstances. It's just contextual. Like, that doesn't apply to your specific situation. And the thing is, if you're not knowledgeable enough, you won't be able to tell the difference. You'll read this and be like, yeah, it's factual what the person said. But then when you look and see, like, hey, they have this in place, this in place, this in place, that doesn't apply to you. And I think, I often tell a lot of people is, if you're reading something online, it may be good to give you directional advice on, hey, you need to look into these things a little bit more specifically as it relates to your situation. But overall, I always tell people is, do not take specific legal or financial advice from something you read online that was not specifically for you.
That's it. It's even like how we tell people with our disclaimer. We're giving general information. Now, it can be used to inform you, to help you. But if you really want a consultation to see what's best for your church, you need to call us and set up a consult, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between general information and stuff that's specific to your ministry, your organization, because everything is different, right? And so, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've seen too with a lot of churches is, understanding that, they don't start off with massive budgets, to where one of the big concerns a lot of people have is, well, we can't afford to do that. And one of the things that I tell people is, you know, you starting off, you may not need to hire somebody on retainer. You
Right.
just may need that. Maybe you need to pay for an
1
hour
hour
or two
session.
of their time
A 1 hour session.
and ask the crucial questions of like, hey, what are the things that I need a lawyer to do or a CPA to do? And what are some of the things that I can do on my own? And I often find that if you're working with someone who actually cares about your type of organization, they'll be willing to, hey, here are the things that you're really going to need a professional's help on. Hey, here are the things that you can do on your own, and here's some pointers to get you in the right direction. And I think that, you know, that hour or 2 hour kind of consultation can provide you with a ton of wisdom and insight. And it doesn't really cost you a ton of money. I mean, I will say is it's going to cost you more if you make a mistake than it will if you just pay for the consultation.
Good advice. It'll be cheaper to spend $300 to $500 with that professional for the 1 hour than to have a $50,000 levy against you. So yeah, I agree with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, when it comes down to, you know, the documentation, one of the areas that you mentioned about with bylaws, and I think a lot of people have heard that and really kind of just diving a little bit more is like what actually goes into the bylaws? Because a lot of times when people are, whether they're starting an organization, they don't know, like, you know, they don't know all the details of, hey, what goes into the bylaws or can we change them over time and stuff like that.
Excellent question. So the bylaws are the rules that govern your church. And a lot of times what you will see is constitution and bylaws. So constitution is kind of like the premise on what do you believe? We believe in God the Father, Jesus was his son, whatever, you know, crucifixion, resurrection, all that good stuff. The bylaws are the rules that govern your church. So you will have a board. How many board members? What will be the board titles on there? President, vice president, secretary, treasurer. What are your rules for handling money? What are your rules for gaining membership to your organization? Those are the types of things. And this is it's an exhaustive list. I just named a few. But bylaws typically are the rules that you set in place to establish how your church is going to be governed. It might not hit everything because in addition to bylaws, you'll have policies and procedures that are getting more, or a handbook that are getting more in depth. But your bylaws are your big ticket items on how your church will be ran, right? Who can become a member, members in good standing. Some people they vote, some people have that. How's the money going to be handled? Two-party process on checks. Those types of rules come in your bylaws.
Mhm. Yeah, I would definitely second that. I do think that, you know, for a lot of people, the way that I've kind of try to help them understand is, you know, your major items that really impact, you know, what you're going to do in your church. I mean, from my perspective, how you're going to handle the finances is a major one. Now, once you start getting into the details of, hey, we use this system, we run this report, that gets more into your policies and procedures. But at a general, there needs to be some kind of rules around, like, you know, how often is it going to be audited, or hey, how do you guys go about an audit, or hey, the budget, the annual budget needs to be approved by X percent of the board, where you have to have at least a 60% vote on something like that. Now, as people think about the bylaws, one of the questions that does come up is, you know, if these bylaws are so, you know, are covering these major things, how often can you change them, and what kind of does that change process tend to look like?
So you can change your bylaws at any time, but typically there has to be a majority vote of your board on what you need to present the action that you want to change, support why, and then take a vote. So let me give you a general definition of what bylaws are. Bylaws are the rules utilized by our organization or ministry to govern how your board makes decisions. That's typically what bylaws are. They're a set of rules used to govern your board's actions and decisions making. And bylaws should be updated and evolved, especially if you use the cookie cutter bylaws to get started. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with cookie cutter bylaws to get started. And sometimes you may not know that things need to be changed until you get into the knee deep of things and start working and saying, hey, we need more or less here. So typically, Bylaws can be changed at any board meeting. So if you have a nonprofit organization, you need to have board meetings. I typically say monthly, no less than quarterly, because you need to meet to discuss the business of the church. That's one of the rules. It should be more than just annual. Monthly is my preference, no less than quarterly. So most bylaws, you put it on your board agenda item. Hey, I think that we should modify or update or eradicate, eliminate such rule. I always say support it. Why are we doing it? Have a discussion with your board. Take a vote on that. Memorialize that in your minutes. Then it's called amendments. You amend your bylaws and you update them and you keep them up to date that everybody knows and sees, and keep it with your record keeping. So as often as need be, as long as you do it by majority vote of your board. You can't unilaterally change the bylaws. So we talked about this before. Pastors, board trustee, because it ain't just the pastors who out here crazy sometimes. No one person can make church changes to the church rules, okay? It typically needs to be a majority vote of your leadership, all right?
Oftentimes I think when people think about churches, I do think they tend to zero in on, hey, the pastor or the bishop is out here, just trying to do things their own way. And I do think sometimes people overlook that you may have trustees, or you may have deacons, or you may have the spouse of a deacon, or the spouse of a person who has a position, to where some craziness goes on. And I think that, things like the bylaws protect the organization, and they protect you to be able to stay focused on what your real mission is, as opposed to dealing with some of the, petty stuff that comes up. Because I will say is that, we all love the Lord, and yes, we should be acting ethically and trustworthy, but every now and then, the human side of some people comes out.
Right.
And
one of the church.
Absolutely. Because one of the things that, that even for myself, like, early on when, I started working with different organizations, especially working with like on the board of not-for-profits, and then working with some churches, like I didn't initially grasp like how important it was to have some of those bylaws in place until like situations came up, and then people are like, well, this person doesn't have the authority to make that decision, or they shouldn't be the one deciding. And it just became this ongoing discussion to where I'm just like, oh, this is why you clarify things like this in the bylaws, so you don't run into having these, last minute, fights and arguments over something that probably should have been discussed before the situation got heated.
Right.
Now, one of the things that I also think that you mentioned that I think is you talked about doing the board minutes and stuff like that. And I think from talking to some people, what I find is that they tend to get a little nervous about, when it comes down to board meetings and stuff. It's like, do we have to follow, like, I think it's what Robert yes, to where it's just like, how formal does that process actually have to be?
I grew up with Robert's Rules of Orders. I grew up United Methodist, y'all. United Methodist got a whole bunch of structure. So motion, a second to that motion, a vote, all in favor, yay, all opposed, say nay. The secretary in the corner writing it down, right? This was before computers and laptops and stuff. Like she hand wrote all that stuff down. These people voted yay. You need to be that formal. It's good to have a system. All right. I prefer Robert's Rules of Orders, and maybe because I grew up with it, it worked for me. I don't use it just in my nonprofit thing. I'm still on for-profit companies, same thing. So the system is there, it's tried and true. The issue is I grew up in a country church. Everybody might not know the proper way to do these things. And there are people who come in and train you and your team on how it should be done. Record keeping is critical. We're talking about documentation today. In my business as an attorney, I win or lose cases based on documentation, right? If I'm representing the plaintiff, it's, can you show what happened to you? If I'm representing the defense, they don't have nothing to prove I did it. You know what I'm saying? And so you need your documentation to cover yourself in a ministry. And so you're going to vet people as much as possible, But if you can show that we have rules in place, bylaws in place, policies in place, they are updated frequently, we keep good records. If you have someone acting untoward and they try to come against the church, not just against that person, you can show we had the rules, they knew the rules, they received the rules, they were trained on the rules, they signed off on the rules. The issue arose to our attention. It deviated from our policy. We took a vote, we investigated. All of these things help the church not be liable because you had good records and good documentation. A lot of churches do the right thing, but we can't prove we did the right thing because all we can say is, we talked about it at the meeting, so-and-so took the vote, where the records at? Where the rules at? I can't use that in a court of law. It helped me if I could have exhibits of, these are bylaws, these are the rules, these are the fact-finding investigations, this is what that person was trained on it, this is where they signed off on it, they knew what they should have known. Then might take the liability away from the church and put it on that individual person because the church made them aware, they acted on it, they did something about it. So now the church isn't liable. We could talk about the difference between a slap on the wrist and being in debt for 6 or 7 figures just by having documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even from a finance end and from an audit end, one of the common sayings is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
That's the truth. Same way
to where,
because I tell some of my clients, don't write anything down, don't record the meeting, buzz everybody, take cell phones, right? Some things we don't want recorded. Let's be honest. Yeah.
And I do think that in some of those cases, like I've even, been in meetings where we talk about things where, like, say, we may go into let's say an executive session, or to where there's some things that, hey, we don't want to talk, whether it's like we may be talking about something that's very confidential, to where we don't want it documented just yet, because it's extremely confidential and it's in very, is still in the idea stage where we're trying to gauge. But if it is something that we are going to take action on as an organization, it's just like, hey, we need to have documentation to support that. Because if someone comes, especially if you're in a not-for-profit organization, as we've said, the authorities give special rules and special permission applies to not-for-profit organizations, because there are some things, financially with the IRS that those requirements that you don't have to follow, like paying taxes and stuff like that. So the government is highly, highly sensitive to, hey, what are you doing? What's the support? What's the justification for it? And I definitely think the documentation is just something that protects everybody involved when there is more clarity about what's going on and who was involved in the decision and when was it approved. And so when it comes down to the meetings, from your perspective, what do you think are the critical things that should be in there? I know we've talked about, like, hey, what the topic was, who voted, like, are there other critical things that should be in the minutes?
You don't have to record it word for word, but you need an accurate summary of, I call them action items, right? You need an accurate summary of whatever that was addressed, especially voted upon, right? And so a summation of what it was, that it was supported and presented, that it was explained to the board so they wasn't arbitrarily making decisions, and the record on the vote. So a good summary. So if we talking about, I don't know, you can go to anything with churches, but whatever it is you're addressing, put a good summary of it. Yeah. To show that it wasn't just hey, we're going to vote on pastor's increase today. All in favor? Yay. No, so what? He's working more. There's more responsibilities. It can be bullet points. There's increased responsibilities. He's doing this to this. Because of that, we feel like he needs a $20,000 raise per year. That's enough. It doesn't look arbitrary. You have reasons behind it, was justified, and who voted on it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely think that, having that clarity in there, I mean, it just becomes, I think, a good practice in general when you're leading an organization. I mean, because whenever you're communicating with someone about action items, like even when I meet with my clients, sometimes, like, I'll follow up with a meeting with an email saying, like, hey, based on our meeting, here's what I'm going to do by when, here's what you said you were going to do, is to where you get some type, even if you have a job and one of those things that I learned probably the hard way in my corporate career is you have a meeting with someone, they agreed to do something, they didn't do their part, and we got to the day when the big project was due, and it was all on me because I was like, you know what, that will never happen again.
The follow-up email is key. I do that. The follow-up communication. And I'm gonna give you a reason why you should document and have good records and record keeping. It's not just to keep you out of jail or IRS audit. It helps the people that comes behind you in these positions in your ministries. You want your church to last 100, 200 years. It'll help the next administration or the next generation if we can go back and see good records of, well, this is what they did during that time and why. Or let's just say you have a current change of board members at your church, and the new cohort knows nothing of what the old cohort did. And I feel like we can't know where we're going until we've known where we've been. And so good records helps the next people in line to see where the church was, what they were doing, how was that working, what can be improved. It just helps you to keep growing and building your ministry, my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a good point, because I don't think a lot of people actually talk about that enough, of just the reality that you're not going to want to do the same role in your ministry like for the rest of your life. At some point, you are going to want to move on to something else, or there's some responsibilities you're going to want to hand off to other people. I mean, especially when it comes down to,
you keep your role till they die. You better not take that position. You better not take that position. She was the head usher for 54 years. She got arthritis now and her knees hurting, but you better not sit her down. She been over the media ministry since we had data tapes and 8-track. She don't know nothing about what's going on right now. We don't even know what MP3, MP4s are. But don't you take that from her, because she been faithful. She can't help you do that, but she has been faithful. You hear me? I'm sorry. It happens.
No, that does happen. I will say that does happen. But one of the things that I always tell people is that in a church, we are very familiar. Like we officiate funerals at churches. So we know at some point, some people go home to be with the Lord. And one of the things that you don't want is, like I said, that situation with that lady, she's been doing it since the beginning of time. She passes away. Now that thing just starts to fall apart.
Yep.
And I do think that, for a lot of people, even when it comes down to your board, is that sometimes people are on your board for a season of time. Like there are some boards of non-for-profit organization that actually have term limits, so where a person only serves X number of terms, and then, hey, they're replaced by someone else. And if that is the case, it becomes even more critical that you have documentation, because you're going to have somebody new coming in, and for them to get up to speed, you don't want them to spend the first year of their term trying to get up to speed, and then they can eventually become productive. Because I mean, like I said, you're not going to have, some people are not going to be doing the same thing forever in your organization. And even I see that with a lot of pastors and ministers. At some point, like I've met a lot of pastors who said, when I came in the ministry, I was going to do this forever. As they got older, they realized, you know what, my role changed over time, and it needed to change if they were still going to be able to, do the things that God called them to do, and for the organization to grow and evolve where it needed to go. It's like there will be some changes, and the documentation just really helps the organization stay viable and alive through those periods of change.
That's it.
Now, one of the things that, that we've mentioned before that the last thing I wanted to, to kind of touch on is, you talked about, strategic planning, and which will be something we'll probably go a little bit more into another conversation. But from your perspective, Ed, when it comes down to laying out like that strategic plan for the organization, is that something that goes with the bylaws, or is that like a policies kind of procedure, or is that a separate thing?
I think for me, it's separate. To me, strategic planning is the goal of your ministry, organization, or church, right? And the steps that you are going to take to get there. Strategic planning is the big picture. The big picture. We trying to save souls, train and equip disciples, do community outreach on another level. Those are just some of the things. Some people have building funds. We want to build a new sanctuary. We want to do mission. Strategic planners are your large goals, and the step-by-step plans on details of how do we think we're going to get there. What does that look like? So I don't know how eloquently I stated that, but strategic plan to me is a time frame of what are we trying to do, and how are we going to do it, and what's our time limit to get said thing done. And I take a big strategic plan and I break them down into goals, and I break those goals down into action items, and we separate them by department or division, and we get them done. That's how I see it.
Awesome. I love it. Well, we'll definitely talk a bit more about strategic plans in a later session. But definitely wanted to say thank you guys for tuning in. And I would say also go over to the Facebook group. Engage on the Facebook group, join us in the group. There are different things that we're posting there. One of the things that I'm going to be posting and sharing is because someone asked a question about, like documentation retention, like how long do I need to keep some stuff? So this is something that I'll probably post in the group, where I talked about some of the financial stuff that they were asking. They were specifically asking about the financial stuff. And we'll post this and share this kind of checklist, because I think tools like this will help you answer some of those questions. And it makes it a lot easier because you can take this checklist and say, hey, do we have this? Do we have this? How long has this been on file? Do we have this on record? So we'll definitely drop more things like that in the group. Also, I will say is I will be traveling next week. So next week, we probably won't have a show unless Harriet wants to do it solo. It's up to her. But I will say I will probably won't have a show next Monday, but please do drop your questions, and we'll do our best to try to bring those questions up in our conversation. So thank you guys so much for tuning in.